Hi, philosophy and film folks. Happy Thursday. I hope that this video finds you well and that the week is treating you nicely. So today, in class, we'll be discussing this in the live version of class, and we'll have discussions about it, which I know is always kind of a bit frustrating, where some get a discussion, others don't get a discussion, but of course, I think it all kind of balances out in the long run here. But today, just something that I encourage you all to kind of think about, and what we will be discussing in class, is the nature of this course, like the main subject of this course of thinking about film, thinking about the power of film in that capacity, right? And you can see that I've kind of linked a couple of those crash course in philosophy there, or the crash course in film, and what they do is they go into more history that I am absolutely naive to. I do not know film history. I do not know film production. That's not an area of expertise that I have. It's not an area of general knowledge that I really have, even at that, aside from kind of some overview and some engagement as of late. But that being said, there are some, I think, really important questions that we can ask. There are some really important observations that we can make about what film does and what film can do. And so with that, what I want to do is I want to think about and have a quick overview about the nature of film. And I want to ask a handful of questions, and I'll kind of put those on the front load, and then we'll transition into more observations here in just a minute. But three kind of like main questions here, okay? Why are we drawn to films? Like, what is it about them that we're drawn to? Like, why do we go, in a non-COVID world, why do we go to the movies, right? What is it, about the maybe overall experience of going to the movies? Is it, like a fanfare thing, right? Where we go with our family or our partner or our friends, we get some snacks, we sit, we, get, again, kind of like engulfed into another world, whatever that world may be. And so why are we drawn to films? Okay? So that's kind of like one question here, right? Another question is, what can we learn from films? Right? Like, what can we learn by watching films? And this is an interesting question because we can ask, what do we learn from films just by watching them? Like from the content itself in the film? But then we also might be able to ask the question, well, what do we learn about ourselves? Right? In relationship to watching a film. Okay? And this goes into kind of like the third question here of like, how do films influence us? How do films perhaps, or movies that we watch, and I'm using this term movies and film kind of interchangeably, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But how do movies influence us, right? We see a movie at a young age and some kind of residual, recognition is in our minds for a majority of like our upbringing, a majority of our lives, relating back to some film that maybe had a great impact on us, right? And so we have to ask those questions of well, how do films influence us? And then, you can kind of like branch off from that question, think about like, how do certain actors and actresses, or how do certain directors, right, influence us, right? And we can think about like these kind of nuances or genres of film even, right? Like maybe you're really drawn, which goes back to another question, you're really drawn to horror films, right? Well, why, right? And so there's a whole kind of like, there's those three questions, and then we can kind of like, kind of crack the egg and kind of like see where it goes, right? Is that the right phrase? Crack the egg or something like that? We can crack the egg, it shatters, and then we can kind of like see all those pieces that are connected if you put them back together, right? And so I want to have those three questions. And in the live version of class today, we would kind of discuss those, and we kind of like work through those. And again, like, feel free if you have friends that you want to chat about this stuff with. Of course, I welcome it. I encourage encourage it, because I think they're important questions to ask. Right? Now, those three questions I'm going to set aside for a moment, and I want to just kind of like walk through, and I mean, this is the most elementary, kind of maybe surface level view of history of film, or at least a recognition of a history of film there maybe ever was. Okay? And how to like think about this, and I'll show my own biases, right? Going back to like some of our conversations on Tuesday with subjective and objective evaluations, I am undoubtedly kind of influencing some of my subjective. I'm showing some of my subjectivity here, okay? But I think that there's an interesting observation to make. And again, maybe I'm off base here, okay? But I think there's an interesting observation to make insofar as it could be argued that human history, right? And I mean, like, films have not really, like, major, like films, movies, and even pictures have only been around really for not, like, we're coming up barely on 200 years with the first picture, okay? And so then you like trace it back, and it's like, okay, well, we had painting, we had sculpture, right? And you can think about kind of various fervent periods in history with the Renaissance, and you can think about really kind of like big moments in art history, right? That represent some versions of reality, right? And you trace that back, and you say, okay, well, you know, we're all fairly familiar with like those peoples that would you know, the cave drawings, right? And I mean, like, in a way, like that, and this is a cool, like, philosophical question. Like, are those cave drawings, those cave dwellings, are those drawings in the dwellings? Are those in particular art, or were they put up to represent something about the reality in which those people were living, right? And maybe a little bit of both, but still. The main claim I'm trying to make here, the main observation that I'm trying to make here, in some capacity, is that humans seem to have a desire to tell stories, right? We have a desire to engage in stories. We have a desire to engage in versions of reality, right? And versions of the world that we live in, of versions of the world that we don't live in. And so it might very well be the case, right, that like, and I'm using the term story here a bit loosely, I'll admit, right? But the notion of being drawn to carry on stories, to carry on and carry on stories, carry on lineage throughout generations, right? All of that is done via, you know, telling someone a story, okay? And so there's a couple of questions here of like, what have these stories been about, right? That human history hasn't always had film, right? But arguably has always had or wanted to have and to tell stories. So what have these stories been about, right? Over like human history as best we know, right? They've been about our place in the world. They've been about our place like in history, right? And you think about like those cave drawings, you think about, you know, what they represented is they represented what those people were experiencing in their world, right? And you can see like the animals and the spears and, you know, these kind of depictions of hunting, or you can see these depictions of maybe what they thought deities looked like, gods looked like, right? And so what have these stories been about? These stories have been about a lot of the a lot of the same topics that we're still seeing in film today, right? Love, conquest, relation to animals, relationship to the natural world, gods, right? How we engage with each other, all of these being, again, kind of themes that seem to be present years and years ago that are still present today in film. And even more so as we think about kind of like the history of film, and especially because like when we think about film, like that word is maybe a bit misleading as well. Because film, like when you think about like pictures, right? And so like what are pictures intended to do? And I mean, again, this is a really great question. Even as we think about like old pictures, like in the 1800s, where it was a really kind of cantankerous process to take a picture. It was really time consuming, and people had to be really still for a really long time to get that, again, image. And in a way, right, what pictures do on film, and even still like with our selfies, right, that we take selfies or we take pictures for Instagram, and again, which is, again, kind of like interesting in this overall conversation. And the idea that like in this capacity, what those pictures do, what those films do, is they mark time, right? And you can think about this idea that in the 1800s, and especially like moving forward, films, what they do, or at least, pardon me, film, what it does, and you can think about like a family portrait, like if you were lucky in the 1800s, if you had money, you could potentially get a family portrait, and that marked time, right? And so storytelling, and then like thinking about it in terms of film, is this, again, kind of relationship of marking time, okay? And from a little bit of research that I did, the first picture on film was in 1826, and it was kind of like purposeful and accidental, where, again, there's a lot of experimentation about how to make these kind of like images, be still. And since then, right, film has obviously progressed immensely, and it's, digitized on our phones in a split second. But even 1826 is still under 200 years ago. So in a weird way, this is kind of like revolutionary in the last, 194 years. Whew. It's quick math for a philosopher. Okay? The definition of film is the following. A thin, and it's not like very sexy, it's like very technical, right? But film, a thin, flexible strip of plastic or other material coated with light-sensitive emulsion for exposure and in a camera used to produce photographs or motion pictures. And here is where I think that there's a really interesting focus on words, okay? And the focus on word usage here as it relates to film, moving a little forward to motion pictures, right? Now think about that for a second. When we think about like movies, when we think about like what a movie is, like the more technical and antiquated term that gets associated with movies is motion pictures. Like even in like with the Oscars, the Academy Awards, it says best directing in a major motion picture. It's not best directing in a major movie. And so there is something that is still kind of in reference to the fact that film, like both in the historical sense and both in this kind of like marking of time, exists in such a way that a movie is a motion picture. Or flip it just a second and say a picture or pictures in motion, right? That a film or a movie are pictures in motion. And again, I don't think that's like wildly mind-blowing. I don't think that that's overly complex, but I do think it gives us, again, kind of a framework to operate in that is a little more nuanced than expected, okay? And so I'm going to let all of that sit for a second and come up with I've got the second video ready to go here. But I want to dive into the second video here that elaborates and moves a little bit forward from this foundation that we've laid here.